They called me a scientist, colleagues, a patriot. But when I close my eyes, all I see are bodies and eyes, small identical eyes, of twins who didn't know they would become just numbers in an experiment. At that time, I thought differently. The year was 1942. I was 31, had just graduated from medical school with honors, and believed that science should serve the advancement of humanity. But then, humanity was a very selective term. I received a letter with the SS emblem, called to serve as an auxiliary physician in a special center. The letter said, "Your mind will be valuable in building a new future." I didn't know what awaited me, and honestly, I didn't ask. I was put on a military train. In the compartment, the officer looked at me and said, "You are going to Auschwitz. There you will see science, the likes of which the world has never known." I did not answer. I just smiled, a goofy smile of a man who wanted to be needed. When we arrived, the gate was larger than I imagined. Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free. Read the iron sign. I still believed that we were liberating the world from the plague. I didn't know it was us. The soldiers did not smile, the prisoners even less. And when I entered the corridor of Block 10, the main laboratory, I smelled it. A mix of chlorine, sweat, and death. No one talked about it. They just gave me an apron and a sign. My immediate superior was named Josef Mengele. He looked like a regular academic, elegant, smiling, charismatic even. And that's when it all started. Mengele said to me with complete calm, "Here, doctor, we explore what others fear. We touch upon the secrets of race, and you have the honor of taking part in it." I did not answer. I just signed the confidentiality documents. And that night, I fell asleep peacefully, for the last time in my life. It was morning, cool, like most of those days. Mengele asked me to come to the laboratory early. He said, "Today you will begin to understand why you are here." I entered a room where there were 2 metal beds and a table with surgical instruments. In the corner, 2 girls, twins. They were maybe 6. They were skinny, but their eyes looked at me as if they knew more than they should. Mengele walked up to them and knelt down as if he were their uncle. He touched their hair and asked, "How are we feeling today, princesses?" One of them started crying. The other just stood there, motionless, as if frozen. This surprised me. I didn't understand why he was acting this way, but Mengele looked at me and said, "They are unique. This project is more than science. It is the key to genetic purity." We started with the weighing. Each had their own measurement sheet. Height, weight, skull circumference. Mengele recorded everything with the precision of a watchmaker. Then he told me to prepare a syringe of methylene blue. I asked what it would be for. He smiled and replied, "We want to see if it's possible to change eye color. It's just a few drops. It can't hurt." The girl who cried was the first. I approached with the needle and she trembled. She didn't scream. I stuck the syringe in my eye. And then I heard this sound, not scream, something worse. A quiet groan, as if the soul was letting out air. Afterwards, I sat her down on the bed. The other one waited in silence. And suddenly I felt something inside me break. That this is not an experiment. This was white-glove cruelty. But Mengele just looked at me and said, "Write down the reaction, duration, color of tears. Everything counts." I didn't sleep that night. I saw something that can't be erased. Not their eyes, just my hands. At first, everything seemed routine. We would go into the room, measure the children, weigh them, record every change, even the smallest bruise. Mengele used to say, "Every millimeter counts. Twins are a living laboratory." But we were like watchmakers measuring meat, no emotion, no reaction, mechanical. Over time, our procedures became more and more bold. Instead of measuring leg length, we started measuring pain responses. First the pricks, then the pressure, and finally, the cuts. I remember that day very clearly. 2 boys, identical. One had a slight infection in his knee, the other was healthy. Mengele scratched his beard and said, "This is an ideal opportunity to compare the healing process. One will be our reference point, the other experimental." I looked at him uncertainly. I asked, "What exactly do we have to do?" He replied calmly, "We amputate the leg of one of them. We just cut the muscle of the other one. Then we observe." I wanted to say this is crazy, but I didn't say anything. My silence was my consent. The boy lay still. He thought it was just a test like any other. He did not receive anesthesia. Mengele wanted to see the natural reaction of the nervous system. When the surgical saw touched the bone, I heard a sound I will never forget. It wasn't a scream, just a terrifying guttural roar, as if the boy was trying to break free from his body. I stood there holding his hand, saying, "It's almost over." I lied, because I knew this was just the beginning. The second boy watched from the corner of the room. He didn't cry. He didn't move. Only his eyes said it all. Please, not me. I closed the notebook that day with my hands smeared with blood and my soul covered with silence. I don't know what hurt more, his wound or my knowledge that I had done nothing to save him. Man is not born a monster. You don't wake up one day and want to cause pain. It happens slowly, in silence, through everyday life by repeating the same gestures, until one day you don't feel anything anymore. At first, I vomited. I remember clearly, after the third procedure without anesthesia, I ran outside and vomited against the wall. Another doctor looked at me and just said, "We all go through it, then it passes." And indeed, it passed. Not suddenly, slowly. In time, I stopped asking questions. I stopped shivering at the sound of the saw. Even the baby's crying became background. I wore the same apron every day, the same gloves, the same notebook. The routine was comfortable. I didn't have to think. Just record data, measure reactions, compare results. It all had the appearance of science, but somewhere inside, something was starting to burn out. Not because of the blood or the screams. It was only because of this awful awareness that I began to accept it. One evening, Mengele invited us to dinner, an ordinary dinner, with wine, classical music, elegant tableware. We laughed, and a few hours earlier we had cut off the child's ear to test its regenerative abilities. I returned to the barracks late. I sat on my bunk and stared at my hands, are the same hands that touched a baby's skin, now holding a glass of wine. I didn't sleep that night, not because of the nightmares, only because I didn't have any left. The worst thing wasn't what we did. The worst thing was how normal it happened. It was a boy with curly hair and big eyes. He was maybe 8 years old. His name was Elijah. He was one of the twins brought in a transport from Łódź. Quiet, obedient, too polite for what surrounded him. I watched him for several days. I noted his reactions to injections, to temperature changes, to lack of sleep. He was calm, as if reconciled with his fate. One day he came to me before we started the examination. He looked me straight in the eyes and asked, "Doctor, am I going to die today?" I froze. This question hit me like a bullet. Not because it was dramatic, but because I didn't know what to answer. I didn't have a ready formula. I didn't have a script, and he kept looking, calmly, without panic, as if he just wanted to know. I replied, "No, today we're just going to check your heart." He smiled slightly and said, "Fine, but if I die, please tell my brother I love him." I turned around, not because I was busy, but because something inside me broke. I couldn't look at him any longer. We didn't do anything brutal that day, just EKG measurements. But his question echoed in my head the whole time. It didn't stop sounding even after I fell asleep. I heard them in my dreams, in my breath, in every dawn. A few days later, Elijah died, not by my hand, at least not directly. He got an infection after the procedure. This was ignored. He was no longer useful. When his body was brought in, I looked at it and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Shame. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I just sat down and started writing his name in my notebook. Elijah, age 8. Status. Completed. But I had only one question in my head. Am I going to die today? Not him. Me. I don't know when it happened. There was no single moment. No dramatic boundary beyond which you become someone else. It comes slowly, like dust that settles day by day. And one day you wake up and you can't see the face anymore. You see numbers, values, statistical curves. In the beginning, each child had a name. Elijah, Hannah, David, Rebecca. I remembered them. I wrote them down carefully in my notebook. I added comments: calm, sensitive to pain, difficult to contact. But over time, it stopped mattering. Hundreds of new ones appeared. Every day, each of them had the same eyes, the same fear, the same tears. I couldn't lift it. So I stopped seeing children. I have seen cases. Instead of a little girl from the Romanian transport, I wrote, patient, 8731, gender, F, age, 7, neurological response, slow, tissue regeneration, low. I felt my heart grow quieter, my soul shrink day by day. But it made the work easier, because how are you supposed to remove a child's organ without anesthesia? If you think of him as a child, I couldn't fall apart. It was a camp. There was no room for emotions. Mengele said, if you can't look at them as data, you're not ready for real learning. So I studied. I was learning how to not hear the crying, how not to look into the eyes, how to hold a scalpel as if it were a pen, and the body as if it were just a side of paper. Until one day I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize myself. I was no longer a doctor. I was not human. I was a tool, cold, accurate, statistical. And today, when I try to remember the face of one of those children, I can't. But I remember the numbers, parameters, crooked, Dane. This is what remains. Not everyone was like me. Not everyone could keep silent. There was a young doctor among us. His name was Kruger. I don't know if that's his real name. No one asked any questions. He joined us later in early 1944. He was quiet, disciplined, and had a good surgical hand. But he had something in his eyes that the others hadn't had in a long time: anxiety. At first he observed. He filled out forms. He cut, stapled, analyzed. But after each treatment he would sit up by himself. He would stare at the wall for a long time. I saw his hands shaking as he wrote reports, until one day he couldn't stand it anymore. We were at the table, 2 children. An experiment with a blood transfusion between twins, a risky, deadly procedure. Kruger stepped back from the table and said, I can't do this. This isn't medicine. This is a slaughterhouse. The room fell silent. Mengele looked up from his notes. He smiled slightly, as if he had heard something funny, and he just said, if you don't want to participate, you can go back to your barracks, but you have to be ready tomorrow. Kruger didn't answer. He simply left. In the evening, I went to him. I wanted to talk, maybe convince him that it's better to keep a low profile, but his bunk was empty. Nothing was left. No notes, no apron. Not even his name was on the personnel list anymore. I asked another doctor, do you know what happened to Kruger? He just looked at me and whispered, you don't ask about people like that. Not here. I then understood something important. We weren't just doctors. We were tools and prisoners of our own silence. If someone rebelled, he disappeared. Sometimes physically, sometimes in documents. And so Kruger ceased to exist, and a new face took his place at the table, younger, quieter, unaware yet that here conscience was a luxury no one could afford. This was no longer research. It wasn't even pseudoscience. It was a pure psychological experiment, but not on children, on ourselves. It started with simple observations: how long a child could endure pain before losing consciousness. At first it was a form of nervous resilience assessment. That's what we called it. It sounded scientific, neutral, seemingly logical. The child sat on the table. We inflicted small wounds, cuts, punctures, controlled injuries. Each one was assigned a number, duration of pain, and level of screaming. We measured everything: respiratory rates, blood pressure, response threshold. But data wasn't the goal. The goal was to see when it would burst, when the body turns itself off so as not to feel, when the mind says, enough. One day we tested it on a boy from Hungary. He was 9 years old. He was emaciated but healthy. We started with incisions on the forearm. Then we moved on to burning with a metal plate. After each action, we noted the reaction. The boy was brave, too brave. He didn't scream, he just gritted his teeth, until finally his body shuddered, his eyes rolled back, and he fell. He fainted. Mengele looked at his watch. 13 minutes and 8 seconds. We wrote it down, as if it were a sports result. The child was later transferred to the recovery room, not to help him, but let's get back to the experiment the next day. After everything was over, I sat down in the corner of the room. I looked at my notes. There was nothing there about who he was, numbers only, values, abbreviations, and I had only one thought in my head: how many more children must we break before we break ourselves? But then Mengele came over and said, "Good pace. Tomorrow we'll do the same with the girl." I nodded, because I was no longer human. I was a mechanism, part of a machine that fed on pain and called it progress. It was something that cannot be described medically. No device recorded this moment. There was no screaming, no tremors, only silence. The girl was 7 years old. She was third in a series of experiments on sleep deprivation and mechanical pain. She said almost nothing. She just watched, always in the same direction, towards the wall, as if there was something there. For several days we exposed her to a series of stimuli: noise, heat, hunger, a night without sleep. Each morning we recorded changes in heart rate, pupillary reaction, and sweating. But on the 7th day, something changed. She entered the room and didn't say a word. She sat up in bed. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She didn't react when I touched her arm, or when the needle entered the skin, or when I burned her hand. There were physiological reactions, but she was gone, as if something inside her had switched off, as if the soul, tired of torture, simply left. I called the second doctor. We checked the EEG. It was shallow but active. The heart was beating, blood was flowing, but she didn't blink, she didn't look. She was not breathing consciously. We sat in silence for a few minutes. No one said it out loud, but we all felt it. It wasn't a baby anymore. It was just a container. Mengele entered the room and simply said, "Interesting, take notes." We wrote down, "No neurological reaction with full somatic awareness." A scientific name for something that science doesn't understand. For the moment when a person dies, but the body continues to live. We left her in solitary confinement. A few days later, she died in her sleep, apparently without pain. But I didn't remember her because of her death. I remember it because I saw how life can be extinguished without a single drop of blood. And ever since then, I have always wondered, how many of these children actually died physically, and how many just disappeared inside, forever? At first I believed. Really, I wasn't pretending, I wasn't fooling myself. I thought that what we were doing was for the future, that the suffering of an individual can be justified by the progress of all humanity. I kept telling myself, every great scientific revolution requires sacrifices, and that we are pioneers, that history will understand us. But over time, these sentences sounded like an empty echo. Quotes cut from propaganda pamphlets, repeated by people who were afraid to look in the mirror. It started with questions, small. For example, why are we doing this experiment? Will it make a difference? Or, don't we already have this data? Why are we doing it again? But these questions were not welcome. To ask them was to be weak, and the weakness disappeared. So we stopped asking. Or maybe we never really started. Sometimes I looked at my friends at the table. They carefully cut into the children's bodies, noted their reactions, and discussed muscle structure, as if this were an anatomy lesson. not the tearing apart of a living creature, but in their eyes I saw something familiar, uncertainty, frozen deep, well hidden. It's like we're all playing the same game. We pretend this makes sense so we don't go crazy. Because if that wasn't science, so what was that? Sadism, ritual, a ruthless machine in the name of ideology. I have no answer. I only have memories. And that constant voice in my head that keeps repeating, "You are not a victim. You were not forced. You simply stopped asking." Or maybe this is what makes a man a monster, not brutality, but the willingness to stop feeling, just to be able to continue functioning. Everything began to fall apart in late 1944. Rumors circulated between the blocks like smoke. The Russians were coming. The Allies were already in France. People started looking each other in the eye differently, not with power, with anxiety. Mengele stopped joking. He locked himself in the office for long hours. He called us together quietly, in the evenings, away from the support staff. One day he just said, "Not everything can survive. Not everything should." They gave us boxes, stacks of reports, photos, sketches, samples. They told us to choose what was worth keeping and what should be burned. But how do you burn evidence of the existence of a child whose face you can't remember? I threw the pages into the fire. Names, dates, numbers. Data I had once meticulously collected now disappeared in the flames as if it had never existed. I remember one piece of paper, inscription at the top. Twins, number 512 and 513. Reaction after amputation of lower limbs. Death after 72 hours. I couldn't burn it. My hand shook, but I threw it in because that's what they said. Within a few weeks, thousands of pages disappeared. The knowledge collected over the years in the form of crimes now turned to ash, but the memories didn't burn. The sound of breaking bones could not be destroyed. It was impossible to erase the look in the eyes of a child who knew he was dying. You couldn't burn your conscience. Some of us have tried. They got drunk. They were silent for whole days. One doctor hanged himself in the barracks, but most of us just put on our uniform, went out like any other day, and pretended that everything still made sense. Because even when everything is falling apart, one clings to appearances. But the dust from the war didn't cover everything. He didn't cover me, I remember. And this remembering burns more than the fire that consumed our sins on paper. In January 1945, everything fell apart. The orders became chaotic. The guards disappeared. Mengele disappeared. Literally, like a shadow. We were left alone. Some of the doctors escaped in uniform, pretending to be line officers. Others burned the remaining evidence, took false documents, and disappeared into the forests. I had a plan, new identity, new address, friends from Berlin who were supposed to help me, but no matter what I did, there was something I couldn't leave behind. The first night I left camp, I slept in an old farmhouse to the south. It was quiet, too quiet. At 2 in the morning, I was woken by the sound of footsteps, small, slow, regular. I thought it was someone from patrol, but there was no one there. In the following days, the same thing repeated itself, always at the same time. Steps, sept, breath. I started telling myself it was nerves, trauma, but then I started feeling. I could feel something that was standing right behind me when I sat down at the table. Something moving in the corner of the room as I was falling asleep. Something that wasn't human, but had the faces of children that I couldn't forget. Sometimes in my dreams I saw whole rows of them. They stood in silence, without shouting. They just watched, not with hate, with a question. "Do you remember us?" I remembered, every single one of them, not by name, but by moment. The girl whose hand I burned, the boy who fainted after 13 minutes, twins who died together holding hands. Every night was a trial. Each morning, light is an unfulfilled sentence. I couldn't tell this to anyone. In my new life, I was a doctor, quiet, competent, respected. But when I sit alone, when I feel those footsteps again, I know I didn't run away. Ever. Because what's coming behind me doesn't wear shoes. He's not breathing. He doesn't speak. To echo of the children who had no right to survive. And one question that comes back every night. Why? After the war, the world didn't want to know. Not right away. Not everything. We changed our names. We left the cities where we were known. We were scattered, like ashes after a fire that went out too late. We swore to each other that we would not speak, not because we were afraid of the verdict, just because no one wanted to hear the truth. A few of us have tried, out loud, in courts, in testimonies, but most of them fell silent, like me. In my new life I had a wife, kid, patients who trusted my hands, but I never trusted myself. I repeated the same rituals every day: smile, consultation, prescription, thank you, and inside, decay. Because this silence, which was supposed to protect me, became a punishment. In the silence I heard their voices. In the silence I saw their faces. In the silence I recalled every detail I wanted to forget. I had no one to tell this to. I couldn't, because who would want to know that a doctor who treats children once destroyed them? Sometimes I stood in front of the mirror and whispered to myself, I am guilty, but no one heard it. Only an echo. When I visited war graves, I did so incognito, not as one who participated, but as the one who wore their shadows. People ask how the criminals could live after all this. I answer, some were dead, breathing, working, but not alive. Because real hell is not fire. It is knowing that no one is judging you because your own silence has already killed you. And I have been silent for years, not because of fear, because of the noise that what I have not said makes inside me. Years have passed. I changed my name. I changed addresses, countries, even languages. With every step I took, I left an old version of myself behind. The one who wore the apron at Auschwitz. The one who wrote down numbers instead of names. I built a new life, like a man who knows he doesn't deserve a second chance, but he lives as if he were trying to carry it. The patients liked me. I was calm, precise, and helpful. No one suspected. Nobody asked any questions, until that day. I was sitting in a cafe in Zurich. I liked this place. Quiet, anonymous, with a view of the lake. I ordered a tea and opened the newspaper. And then I felt cold. Not because the temperature has dropped, but because she was there. I didn't recognize her right away. She was older, with grey streaks in her hair, but her eyes, the same. The ones that once stared at me as I held a needle. It was one of the twins, one of those that survived. I froze. She recognized me too. For a split second our eyes met. There was no screaming, no crying, only something worse. A silence that contained all the suffering of the world. She didn't come over. She didn't turn around. She stayed where she was. She sat with a cup looking straight at me, not for a monster, for someone who knows. I gathered my things and left. I left quickly without looking back. But from that moment on, I didn't sleep anymore. If she is alive, how many more does she remember? How many pairs of eyes are still waiting for the truth to come to the surface? Because for a moment I thought I had missed history, but history has faces, and one day they all come back. If you've made it this far, you may be wondering, why am I telling you this? Am I trying to cleanse myself, to unburden myself? The answer is simple: no. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't believe there are words that could erase what I've done. I'm not saying this to make you feel sorry for me. I say this because each generation believes it will never become like the last. And then he is silent. He remains silent when he sees injustice. Stays silent when orders become more important than conscience. Silent until evil becomes the norm. Because evil is not born suddenly. It doesn't come with screams and fire. It comes in silence, in harmony, in looking to the side. That's how it all started, from millimeter measurements, from innocent experiments, from the excuse that it's just one child, then 100, then thousands. I didn't notice when I stopped being human, but I know exactly when I stopped being indifferent. Now, writing this, because if I'm going to die, I want to die with my eyes open. I want you to know that there are no monsters walking around the world. These are ordinary people, with aprons, with pens, with a quiet voice, people like me. And that's why I say, be careful with silence, because it is there that the loudest cries of history are born. If you've made it this far, maybe something inside you has been silent for too long, but now you know. Silence also kills, and remembering is the first step to ensuring it never happens again. Write in the comments, I saw, I heard, I remember. And if you believe that the truth, no matter how dark it may be, must be told, then subscribe, because there are still voices trapped in the archives waiting to be heard.